I had never been much of a believer in the supernatural. I always brushed off ghost stories as figments of overactive imaginations, dismissed creaky houses as old with settling, and scoffed at any mention of curses or hauntings. But after what happened to me, I no longer laugh at those stories. I can't, because what I experienced that night, in that house, was real. And I'll never forget it. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A few friends and I had rented an old house out in the country, miles away from the noise of the city. We were just looking for a place to relax, drink some beers, play cards, and unwind. I was with my two best friends, Sarah and Jake. We had been friends for years, and this trip was a way to catch up since life had pulled us all in different directions. The house we rented was old, built sometime in the late 1800s. It sat on a sprawling, overgrown property surrounded by dense woods. When we pulled up to it that afternoon, it had an eerie charm, the kind of place you could imagine in one of those old Victorian horror movies. But in the daylight, it didn't feel threatening, just a little rundown, with peeling paint and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. We brought our bags inside, finding the house sparsely furnished but cozy enough for a weekend. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, a dusty old living room, and a large kitchen with an antique stove that looked like it had been out of commission for years. There was a fireplace too, which we were excited to use as the evening promised to be cold. After settling in, we spent the first few hours exploring the property. There was a shed out back, half collapsed from years of neglect, and a garden that had long since been swallowed up by weeds. As the sun started to set, we headed back inside and built a fire in the old stone hearth. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. We spent the evening laughing, drinking, and playing cards. The conversation drifted from work to relationships to old stories from our school days. It felt good to be together again, like the weight of the world had lifted for a few hours. But as the night wore on, something shifted. It started when we heard a thump from upstairs. At first, we brushed it off. Old houses make noise, right? The wind was picking up outside, and it could have easily been a draft or something falling over. But then we heard it again, louder this time, a distinct, heavy footfall. It sounded like someone was walking down the upstairs hallway. We all froze, glancing at each other with nervous smiles, trying to laugh it off. Jake, always the skeptic, stood up and grabbed the flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice overly confident as he headed toward the stairs. Sarah and I exchanged a look, neither of us saying anything, but I could tell she felt the same unease I did. Jake disappeared up the stairs, and we waited in silence, listening for any sign of what had made the noise. A few moments passed, and then we heard him call down from the top of the stairs. "Nothing up here, just an old house groaning." But as soon as he said that, there was another noise, a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from inside the walls. Jake came back down, a frown on his face. "I think there's something in the walls, maybe a raccoon or something," he said, shrugging it off. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't as sure as he pretended to be. Sarah suggested we just go to bed, forget about the noises, and deal with it in the morning. We agreed, and after dousing the fire, we headed upstairs to our respective rooms. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet now, too quiet. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, the scraping in the walls, and my stomach twisted with a feeling of dread I couldn't shake. Just as I started to drift off, there was a loud bang from the hallway. It was so sudden, so violent, that I shot upright in bed, my heart racing. The hallway outside my door was pitch black, but I could hear movement. Footsteps again, this time closer, heavier, as if someone or something was pacing just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I listened, frozen in place, as the footsteps continued, back and forth, slow and deliberate. I wanted to call out to Sarah or Jake, but something stopped me. It was like some primal instinct was telling me to stay quiet, to not let whatever was out there know I was awake. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and then there was a soft creak as if the floorboards were bending under the weight of something just outside my door. And then came the whispering, faint at first, barely audible, but there, like the sound of someone muttering under their breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. I held my breath, hoping, praying that it would go away, that this was all some weird dream brought on by the isolation of the house. But then my door handle rattled. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The door didn't open, but it shook, as if someone was trying to turn the knob, testing it, seeing if it was locked. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door, and the whispering faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, I crept out of my room, half expecting to see some sign of what had happened. But the hallway was empty, and both Sarah and Jake looked just as tired and shaken as I felt. Over breakfast, none of us talked about the noises. It was like we had all silently agreed to pretend it hadn't happened. But the tension was thick in the air, and I could see the unease in their eyes. We spent the rest of the day trying to keep busy, exploring more of the property, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It was like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to let our guard down. And every now and then, I thought I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong to anything. That night, the real terror began. Just as we were about to settle in for the evening, the power went out. The whole house plunged into darkness, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. We scrambled for flashlights, but even with the beams cutting through the darkness, the house felt like it had come alive, creaking and groaning with every gust of wind. Then we heard it again. The footsteps, heavy and slow, this time coming from the floor above us. We huddled together in the living room, staring up at the ceiling, listening as whatever it was moved through the house. The footsteps grew louder, coming down the stairs, closer and closer. The door to the living room creaked open, but no one was there. Just the empty hallway, and the sound of breathing, deep and ragged, as if something unseen was standing right in front of us. Suddenly, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. The wind howled through the doorway, sending papers flying, knocking over furniture. In the chaos, we bolted for the door, racing out into the freezing night, our breath visible in the cold air. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. As we fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway. But the house was dark and still, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. We left that place as fast as we could, not looking back. None of us spoke on the drive home, and we haven't spoken about it since. But there's one thing I'll never forget. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, just for a second, and I swear I saw a figure standing in the road behind us, watching us leave. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we got out, we survived, but I still feel it sometimes, like a weight on my chest, a presence that hasn't quite let go, and I know that somewhere, it's still waiting. The first thing that struck me about the old farmhouse was how isolated it felt. When my friends and I decided to spend a weekend at the place, we were seeking a rustic retreat, somewhere we could disconnect and enjoy the fall colors. The farmhouse was advertised as cozy and charming, an ideal setting for relaxation and escape from our busy lives. But from the moment we arrived, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. We drove up a winding dirt road, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in on us as we ascended. The house itself was large and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. It looked like something out of an old horror movie, but we laughed it off, chalking up our nervousness to the excitement of the weekend ahead. Inside, the place was surprisingly well kept. The owner had clearly made an effort to make it comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, antique furniture, and a kitchen stocked with everything we might need. We settled in, exploring the various rooms, and joking about how the place looked like it had been frozen in time. That evening, after unpacking and getting settled, we decided to take a walk through the surrounding woods. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape. The trees were dense, and the underbrush was thick, but we followed a path that led to a small clearing. It was a picturesque spot, and we spent some time there, taking photos and enjoying the quiet. As dusk fell, we made our way back to the farmhouse. The sun had set completely, and the only light came from the dim glow of the farmhouse windows and the faint beams of the moon filtering through the trees. It was then that we noticed something unusual, a figure standing just outside the edge of the woods, barely visible in the darkness. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps someone out for a late stroll. But as we squinted, trying to make out more details, the figure didn't move. It stood still, almost perfectly still, as if it were watching us. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, and we hurried back to the safety of the farmhouse, trying to dismiss the encounter as a figment of our imaginations. Later that night, As we gathered around the fireplace, the mood was light but tinged with an undercurrent of nervousness. We laughed and told stories, trying to shake off the odd feeling we'd had. The wind outside howled, and the house creaked and groaned, adding to the eerie atmosphere. It was during this time that we heard the first strange noise, soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the attic. None of us had been up there. The attic was one of those places we'd avoided, filled with old trunks and dusty furniture. We had assumed it was empty, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible not to feel a growing sense of dread. We joked about ghosts and haunted houses, but the laughter sounded hollow and forced out around midnight. The tapping stopped suddenly. In its place, there was a new sound, a dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor above us. I could see the unease on my friends' faces, and one of them, Jack, suggested we check it out. Despite our fear, we knew we had to investigate. We grabbed flashlights and headed upstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under our weight. When we reached the attic door, we hesitated. The air was colder here, and the door was slightly ajar. We pushed it open slowly and shone our flashlights into the dark space. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, the air thick with dust. There was no sign of what might have caused the noise. We searched the room but found nothing out of the ordinary. We were about to head back downstairs when I noticed something strange on the floor, a trail of dirt leading from the far corner of the attic to the center of the room. It was as if something had been dragged through the dust, but there were no clear footprints, just a disturbing, irregular trail. My friends and I exchanged worried glances, but we couldn't find an explanation for it. We returned to the main floor and settled, but determined to enjoy our weekend. We locked up and tried to put the incident behind us. We decided to go to bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would help us forget the oddities of the evening, but sleep didn't come easily. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The house was silent again, but the crash had come from somewhere downstairs. I woke my friends, and we crept down the stairs, flashlights in hand. The kitchen was in disarray. Cabinets were open, and dishes were scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had gone through the place, rifling through everything. We tried to piece together what might have happened, but there were no signs of forced entry or any logical explanation. We were all on edge, and the sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. The next morning, we decided to leave early. The farmhouse, once charming, now seemed oppressive and foreboding. As we packed up our things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Outside, in the area where we had seen the figure the night before, there were fresh tracks in the snow. They led from the woods to the edge of the farmhouse and then vanished. We left as quickly as we could, none of us wanting to stay a moment longer. As we drove away, I looked back at the farmhouse, still standing there, silent and brooding. The encounter had left us all shaken, and I was determined never to return. The unsettling part came a few days later. While going through the photos from our trip, I noticed something strange in one of the pictures taken in the clearing. In the background, just beyond the tree line, was a shadowy figure, tall, cloaked, and unmistakably watching us. It was almost imperceptible, blending into the darkness, but there it was, caught on camera. The figure in the photo matched exactly what we had seen the night before. It seemed to confirm our worst fears. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. I still wonder who or what that figure was, and why it seemed so intent on making us uncomfortable. But one thing is certain, sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I can't help but feel as though I'm being watched from the darkness, just like that night at the farmhouse. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of everyday life. A group of friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the middle of the woods, far from the nearest town. We had booked it months in advance, excited about the idea of a secluded retreat where we could unwind, play games, and enjoy each other's company. When we arrived, the cabin looked charming in a rustic way. Nestled between towering pines, it was quaint, with wooden walls and a large stone fireplace. The surrounding forest was dense and dark, but that only added to the allure of our escape. The caretaker had left a key under the mat and a note on the table. "Enjoy your stay. The power might flicker during storms," it read. We shrugged it off as a minor inconvenience. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played board games, and laughed about old times. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. We had no idea that this tranquility was about to be shattered. The second evening, as we sat around the fire telling ghost stories, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the windows. The power flickered a few times, but we were prepared with candles and flashlights. It was during this storm that things began to go wrong. I was telling a particularly creepy story about a ghost that haunted a remote farmhouse when I noticed something strange outside the window. Through the curtains, I could see a shadow moving in the distance, moving back and forth. It was too dark to make out any details, but the movement was erratic and seemed almost deliberate. I pointed it out to my friends, but they dismissed it as a trick of the storm. "It's probably just the branches swaying," someone said. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to investigate. With my flashlight in hand, I opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and the rain pelted my face like needles. I moved toward the edge of the forest, where I had seen the shadow. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rain-soaked trees and underbrush. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a figure standing among the trees. It was tall and cloaked, but it wasn't clear if it was a person or something else entirely. The figure stood completely still, its presence almost blending into the darkness. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the storm made it nearly impossible. Suddenly, the figure began to move toward me. My heart raced as I hurried back to the cabin, the storm intensifying around me. I burst through the door, breathless and drenched, and told my friends what I had seen. They were skeptical but agreed to check it out. We armed ourselves with flashlights and a few baseball bats, just in case. As we stepped back outside, the storm seemed to have calmed slightly, but the wind still howled through the trees. We reached the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing there. The ground was wet and muddy, and the only traces were the fallen branches and debris scattered by the storm. We searched the area, calling out, but there was no response. We eventually decided to head back to the cabin, chalking it up to the storm playing tricks on our minds. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though none of us slept well. The wind continued to howl, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving a fresh layer of snow on the ground. We decided to go for a walk, hoping the daylight would clear our heads. As we walked through the snow-covered forest, we found something unsettling. Near the edge of the trees, there were large, strange tracks in the snow, leading away from the cabin. They were unlike any animal tracks we had ever seen, with elongated, claw-like impressions that seemed to drag through the snow. The tracks led into the forest and then abruptly stopped, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. We followed the tracks for a while, but they led us deeper into the woods, and we soon realized we were straying too far from the cabin. Reluctantly, we turned back, the uneasy feeling of being watched returning with every step. The rest of the day was tense. We stayed indoors, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. That night, we decided to sleep in shifts, just in case. I volunteered for the first shift, sitting by the window with a flashlight and a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I saw it again. A dark figure in the distance, standing just beyond the edge of the forest. It was moving slowly, gliding as if it were floating. My heart pounded as I woke the others, and we quickly gathered by the window, staring into the darkness. The figure moved closer, and we could see that it was indeed cloaked in something dark, though it was impossible to make out any features. It stopped just outside the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint glimmer of eyes staring back at us from beneath the hood. Panic set in. We locked all the doors and windows, huddled together in the middle of the room. The figure seemed to linger for a while, its presence filling the space with an oppressive feeling. The minutes felt like hours as we waited for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The night passed in tense silence, and the next morning we found no trace of it outside. The tracks from the previous day had been covered by new snowfall, erasing any evidence. We packed up and left the cabin as soon as we could. None of us wanted to stay another minute, and we drove back to town in uneasy silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. To this day, I can't explain what we saw that night. The figure, the tracks, the feeling of being watched, it all felt too real. And while I can't be sure of what it was, I have a nagging suspicion that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting in the darkness. We've never returned to that cabin, and none of us ever plan to. Every time I think back to that night, I remember the feeling of dread, the sight of that shadowy figure, and the realization that sometimes, the things we can't explain are the most terrifying of all. A few years ago, I experienced something that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. My friends and I decided to rent a cabin for a weekend getaway. We were all looking forward to escaping the noise of the city and reconnecting with each other. We found a charming little cabin in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and away from the usual tourist paths. It seemed perfect. When we arrived, the weather was calm and pleasant. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a large stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a big porch overlooking a small, frozen lake. The surrounding forest was serene, and the snowfall had turned everything into a picturesque winter wonderland. We settled in quickly, stoking the fire and opening a few bottles of wine. As the night progressed, we reminisced about old times, played board games, and enjoyed the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, as if nothing could disturb our peace. Around midnight, one of my friends, Dave, suggested a walk to the lake to check out the view. We all agreed, eager to see the lake in its wintry splendor. We bundled up in our coats and scarves and made our way outside. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape, making it look even more enchanting. We walked down to the lake, which was now a solid sheet of ice. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of snow under our boots. As we stood on the lake, admiring the night sky, we noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from the tree line at the far end of the lake. At first, we thought it might be the reflection of the moon on the ice, but the glow was too distinct, too focused. It seemed to pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. We trudged through the snow towards the source of the light. The glow grew stronger as we approached, casting long shadows among the trees. The wind had picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak, adding an unsettling soundtrack to our adventure. When we reached the tree line, the source of the glow became clearer. There was an old, decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, with its windows shattered and the roof caved in. The light was coming from a single flickering lantern placed outside the door. It swung gently with the wind, casting erratic shadows that danced across the snow. We stood there for a moment, hesitant. None of us had ever seen this cabin before, and we all felt a strange unease. Still, we decided to take a closer look. As we approached, the lantern's light seemed to flicker more intensely, as if reacting to our presence. Dave, always the adventurous one, reached out to open the door. As he touched the handle, it creaked loudly, echoing through the silent woods. We all jumped, but Dave pushed the door open with a determined shove. The interior of the cabin was dark, and a musty smell wafted out. We hesitated at the threshold, but curiosity drove us inside. The cabin was in disarray. Old, dusty furniture was scattered around, and remnants of what looked like old personal belongings were strewn about. There was a sense of abandonment and decay. The air was thick and heavy, and we could hear our footsteps echoing unnervingly. We moved further in, shining our flashlights around. That's when things started to get weird. The temperature dropped suddenly, and we began to see our breath in the air. A soft, mournful sound began to fill the cabin, like a distant, indistinct whisper. We tried to locate the source of the noise, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I noticed something on the floor, a trail of small, muddy handprints leading from the door to an old, moth-eaten armchair in the corner. The handprints were scattered and irregular, as if someone had dragged themselves across the floor. The sight was disturbing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I mentioned it to the group, and we all began to feel increasingly uneasy. We decided it was best to leave, but as we turned to head back, the door slammed shut with a resounding bang. We all screamed, the sound echoing through the cabin. Dave rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if it was being held shut from the other side. Panic set in. We tried to force the door open, but it was no use. The lantern outside continued to flicker, casting eerie shadows through the broken windows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt like we were surrounded by unseen eyes. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, and the door creaked open by itself. We bolted outside, not daring to look back. The snow was falling heavily now, and the lake was shrouded in a thick fog. We ran back to our cabin as fast as we could, our hearts pounding in our chests. Once inside, we locked the door and huddled together, too shaken to speak. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and fear. We barely slept, and the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken dread. The next morning, we decided to check out and leave early. We packed our things quickly and avoided the old cabin by the lake. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The snow was covering the tracks we had left, and the mysterious glow was gone. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned the true story behind that cabin. I was chatting with a local at a coffee shop, and the subject of our strange experience came up. The local told me that the old cabin had been abandoned for decades and was rumored to be haunted. It had a dark history involving a family that had vanished mysteriously years ago. As if on cue, I received a message from one of my friends who had found an old newspaper article online. It detailed a case from the 1970s about a missing family that had lived in that cabin. The details were eerily similar to our experience: strange lights, unsettling sounds, and the discovery of muddy handprints. The case had never been solved. The discovery left me with a chilling sense of realization. Whatever we encountered that night was more than just a figment of our imagination. The handprints, the whispers, and the eerie glow were all connected to the dark history of that place. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with us, trying to draw us into its dark past. That experience remains one of the most unsettling of my life, and every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I can't help but think back to that night. The old cabin by the lake remains a haunting memory, a reminder that sometimes, the past is best left undisturbed. Last winter, I decided to take a much-needed break from the grind of everyday life and booked a weekend stay at a remote cabin in the mountains with 2 friends. We had been friends since college and had shared many adventures, but this trip was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to relax, catch up, and escape the constant buzz of city life. The cabin was charming in its rustic simplicity, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. It sat alone on a hill surrounded by dense forest. The drive up was long, winding through snow-covered roads that glistened under the overcast sky. By the time we arrived, twilight had begun to creep in, casting eerie shadows over the snow-covered landscape. We settled in, started a fire, and began preparing dinner. The cabin was cozy, and the warmth from the fire felt comforting against the chill of the winter air. We joked and laughed, recounting old stories and planning our hikes for the next day. Everything felt normal, even idyllic, but as the night wore on, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a creeping unease settled over me. It was as if the forest outside was holding its breath, waiting for something. I brushed it off as the result of being in a new place, and we continued our evening with no more than the occasional glance toward the darkened windows. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the trees sway ominously. I tried to ignore the sounds, telling myself it was just the wind, but sleep didn't come easily. The cold seemed to seep through the walls, chilling me despite the warmth of the fire. I must have finally drifted off when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The wind was still howling, but now it seemed to carry something else: a low, rhythmic thudding. I glanced at my friends, still asleep, and decided to investigate. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed a flashlight. The cabin was eerily silent except for the persistent thudding coming from outside. I opened the door carefully, the cold air hitting me like a wall. Snow was still falling heavily, and visibility was poor. I shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing unusual in sight. The thudding seemed to come from the direction of the forest, so I ventured a little way into the snow-covered yard. The sound grew louder, and then, abruptly, it stopped. I stood there shivering, my breath visible in the cold night air. My flashlight beam swept over the trees, their twisted branches creating unsettling shapes in the darkness. Suddenly, the thudding started again, but now it was closer. My flashlight flicked over the trees, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the falling snow, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving swiftly among the trees. It was tall, and it seemed to glide rather than walk. Its movement was unnaturally smooth and deliberate, and its shape was obscured by the snow and darkness. I froze, unable to move. My flashlight's beam caught a fleeting glimmer of something red, a pair of eyes, glowing with an intense and natural light. The figure seemed to be approaching the cabin, and a surge of fear made me turn and sprint back inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I told my friends what I'd seen, but they were skeptical, attributing it to my overactive imagination and the spooky atmosphere of the cabin. We decided to stay up for a while longer, just in case, but the tension in the room was palpable. As the night dragged on, the sounds outside continued, occasional thuds and rustlings, but nothing more concrete. Eventually, We all managed to fall asleep, though it was fitful and uneasy. The next morning, the sky was clear, and the snow had stopped. The forest outside looked serene and beautiful, the sunlight glinting off the snow-covered trees. We decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear our minds. We followed a trail that Matt, one of my friends, was familiar with. The hike was pleasant, the crisp air invigorating, but the uneasy feeling from the night before lingered. As we walked, we found ourselves back at the edge of the forest, close to where I had seen the figure. Matt, ever the adventurer, suggested we explore a bit further into the woods. The path led us deeper into the forest, the trees becoming denser and the light dimmer. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, the crunch of snow beneath our boots echoing around us. Then, we came across something odd, a series of large, unusual tracks in the snow. They were not animal tracks, but large, deep impressions that seemed to lead in a circle. We followed them, curiosity piqued, until we reached a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old, abandoned cabin. It was falling apart, with one side caved in and windows shattered. We approached cautiously, but the door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was empty, except for a few broken pieces of furniture and old, cobweb-covered odds and ends. But what caught my eye was a large, weathered journal lying open on the floor. I picked it up, the pages yellowed and brittled. As I skimmed through it, a chill ran down my spine. The journal described the experiences of a hermit who had lived in these woods decades ago. The entries grew increasingly erratic and disturbing, mentioning encounters with dark, hooded figures and strange occurrences that mirrored exactly what we had experienced. The final entry was the most chilling. It read, "They are not what they seem. They watch and wait, their eyes glowing red in the dark. They are closer now, and I fear I will not escape." My hands shook as I closed the journal, my heart racing. I looked at my friends, who were equally unsettled. We decided it was time to leave, the sense of dread overwhelming. We made our way back to the cabin, hurriedly packing up and leaving as soon as we could. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The events of the previous night and morning weighed heavily on us. When we finally reached our homes, we felt an immense relief, but the sense of unease lingered. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was going through some old photos from our trip, that I found something that made my skin crawl. In one of the pictures taken from the hike, there was a shadowy figure in the background, barely visible among the trees. Its shape was indistinct, but its eyes, those same glowing red eyes, were unmistakable. We had been watched that night. Whatever was in the forest hadn't been a figment of my imagination or a trick of the light. It had been real, and it had been closer than we realized. I never went back to that cabin or the forest. I still don't know what we encountered, but every time I see a shadow moving in the dark or hear an unexplained noise, I remember those red eyes watching us from the depths of the forest. It was one of those weekends that started out with good intentions but quickly spiraled into something far more unsettling. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend at a cabin we'd rented in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a break from our hectic city lives. We imagined sitting by the fire, enjoying some drinks, and catching up. Instead, it turned into a nightmarish experience that none of us would ever forget. The cabin was rustic and charming, an old log structure surrounded by dense woods. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque in daylight, but as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, it took on a more sinister aspect. The air grew colder, the trees seemed to loom closer, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind howling through the forest. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, but the creeping darkness was already swallowing up the landscape. We unpacked our things and decided to explore the nearby woods before it got too dark. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led into the forest. It seemed like a nice way to get some fresh air and stretch our legs after the long drive. The forest was dense, the trees so thick they blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The trail was narrow and twisted, and the deeper we went, the more we felt like we were being watched. It was probably just our imaginations running wild, but the feeling of being observed was palpable. We joked and laughed to keep our spirits up, but the atmosphere was undeniably eerie. As we wandered further, we came across an old, decrepit shed. It was half hidden by overgrown bushes and vines, with a roof that sagged under the weight of time and neglect. The door hung ajar, creaking slightly with the wind. Naturally, our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a look inside. The interior of the shed was dark, filled with the smell of mildew and rot. Broken tools and old, rusted equipment were scattered around, along with some decaying wooden crates. We poked around for a few minutes, exchanging nervous laughter as we discovered old, forgotten relics. Then, just as we were about to leave, we heard something. A faint sound, like a low, mournful moan, drifted through the air. We froze, straining to hear it again. The sound was coming from outside, just beyond the edge of the shed. It was almost like a human voice, but distorted and indistinct. We looked at each other, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in our eyes. Deciding to investigate, we stepped out of the shed and followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The moan grew louder and more distinct, morphing into something that sounded like a cry for help. We were about to turn back when we saw a figure standing in the distance, shrouded in shadow. It was tall and thin, with a hooded cloak that seemed to blend into the darkness. Its presence was unsettling, almost spectral. The figure was standing still, facing away from us, and we could only see the dim outline of its form. The moans seemed to emanate from it, adding to the eerie atmosphere. We stood there, frozen in place. The figure remained motionless, as if it was waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or sheer terror. We decided to back away slowly, not wanting to provoke whatever it was. As we turned to leave, the figure suddenly moved out and began to glide toward us with an unnatural, fluid motion. There was no sound of footsteps, just the eerie rustling of its cloak as it moved through the underbrush. Panic surged through us, and we began to run, the moans turning into a distorted, haunting wail. We made it back to the cabin, breathless and shaken. We locked the doors and huddled around the fireplace, trying to calm down. The warmth of the fire was a small comfort, but the sense of dread remained. We talked about what we'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume, maybe it was just our imaginations, but deep down, we knew something was off. As the night wore on, the wind howled louder, and the cabin seemed to groan under the pressure. We decided to play some board games to distract ourselves, but the fear never really left. Every creak of the cabin or gust of wind made us jump. It wasn't until we heard a loud thud on the roof that we truly panicked. The sound was heavy, almost like something or someone was moving around up there. We all exchanged frightened glances. The thudding continued, growing louder and more insistent. We were too scared to go outside to check, so we huddled together, our nerves on edge. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, and our fears seemed to hang in the air like a tangible presence. We waited for what felt like hours, the tension almost unbearable. Eventually, we decided to check the roof. We went outside and climbed up onto the small balcony, the snow crunching underfoot. The roof was covered in a thick layer of snow, and there were no footprints or signs of disturbance. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. We went back inside, exhausted and on edge. We decided to stay up and keep watch, taking turns to keep an eye out for anything unusual. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the fear never fully dissipated. In the morning, we packed up quickly and left the cabin, eager to put the experience behind us. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin and the surrounding woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had been lurking in the darkness. Years later, I still think about that night. The memory of the hooded figure and the haunting moan still sends shivers down my spine. I don't know what we saw or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. There was something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't have been. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right or the shadows move in a certain way, I can almost hear those mournful cries again, reminding me that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to celebrate Halloween in an unconventional way. Instead of hitting up the usual parties or haunted houses, we wanted something more authentic, something that would genuinely give us a fright. So, when we heard about an old abandoned asylum just outside town, reputed to be one of the most haunted places in the area, we jumped at the chance to explore it. Little did we know, our adventurous spirit would lead us into something far more terrifying than we could have imagined. The asylum had been closed for decades. Its dark, crumbling facade was infamous for sending chills down the spine of anyone who dared to look at it. According to local legends, the asylum had been the site of numerous experiments and treatments that bordered on inhumane. Over the years, There were countless stories about eerie noises and ghostly apparitions that had plagued the building. Despite all the warnings, my friends and I were eager to experience it firsthand. On Halloween night, we gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and some basic protective equipment. We drove out to the asylum, the excitement in the car palpable. As we approached the place, the atmosphere grew heavier. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw of darkness, with broken windows and a rusted iron gate. We parked a safe distance away, gathered our courage, and made our way through the overgrown lawn to the front steps. The door was surprisingly ajar, creaking softly as the wind blew. We hesitated for a moment but soon pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the musty odor of decay. Our footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The building was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. Old medical equipment lay scattered about, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The walls were peeling, and graffiti decorated many surfaces, adding to the grim atmosphere. As we ventured deeper, we came across a staircase leading down to what appeared to be the basement. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the temperature dropped noticeably as we descended. The basement was even more unsettling, flickering lights, broken furniture, and the constant drip of water from somewhere above. The place felt like a scene from a horror movie. We split up to explore, each of us taking a different part of the basement. I was in what seemed to be an old storage room, filled with broken medical supplies and abandoned personal belongings. I was examining a dusty old cabinet when I heard a noise coming from the far end of the room. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like something moving slowly across the floor. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing but shadows and debris. I called out to my friends, but there was no response. The silence was unnerving. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping up my spine and continued to explore. That's when I saw a small, old-fashioned wheelchair partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. The chair looked out of place, almost as if it had been carefully positioned there. I approached it, and as I did, I noticed something even more disturbing, a faint, wet handprint on the armrest. My heart started to race. I quickly backed away and called out again, this time more urgently. I heard footsteps approaching, and my friends came into view, their faces pale with a mix of excitement and apprehension. We decided it was time to move on and headed toward what appeared to be the main hallway leading to the exit. As we walked, we started to hear strange noises, distant whispers, the faint sound of footsteps echoing our own. We chalked it up to the building's age and the wind playing tricks on us. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, its walls holding secrets and stories of suffering. We reached the main corridor, and that's when the real terror began. One of my friends, Lisa, spotted something in one of the rooms off to the side. She shined her flashlight inside and saw a dark figure standing in the corner. It was cloaked in shadows, and even with the light, we couldn't make out any details. Lisa gasped, and we all turned to look. The figure stood completely still, as if waiting for us to approach. We moved closer, but the figure remained motionless. Just as we were about to get a closer look, a loud bang came from the ceiling above us. It was so sudden and forceful that we all jumped, our flashlights flaring wildly as we tried to locate the source of the noise. When we looked back, the figure was gone. The room was empty. We searched for any signs of where it might have gone, but there was nothing. Panic started to set in as the oppressive silence returned. We decided it was time to leave and made our way back toward the stairs, but as we ascended, we heard the door slam shut behind us. We raced back to find it, but it was locked tight. We pounded on the door trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Our flashlights flickered, adding to the growing sense of dread. We were trapped. Just as our fear was reaching its peak, we heard a faint, but unmistakable sound, a soft, eerie laugh, echoing through the hallways. It was a laugh that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, twisting our nerves. We turned to each other, our faces reflecting pure terror, but we knew we had to stay calm. Then, through the dim light, we saw something that made our blood run cold. In the corner of the hallway, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows. It was the same dark figure we had seen earlier, but this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the darkness, were dozens of smaller shapes, moving in a grotesque, writhing mass. The laughter grew louder, more frenetic. We turned and ran, desperate to escape. Our fear lent us speed, and we managed to find another exit, pushing through the heavy door and stumbling out into the snow. We ran to the car, not looking back, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We drove away from the asylum, not daring to stop until we were safely back in town. We didn't speak much on the drive, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. It wasn't until weeks later, when we were reviewing the footage from the cameras we had brought, that we saw something chilling. In one of the frames, just before the figure had disappeared, there was a brief moment where it seemed to have shifted. For a split second, we could see faces, dozens of distorted, anguished faces embedded within its shadowed form. They were screaming silently, their mouths open in a soundless plea for help. The asylum was closed off shortly after our visit, with no official explanation given. We never went back, and none of us spoke of it often. But that experience left a mark on us, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the echo of that eerie laugh, a haunting reminder of what we encountered in that old asylum. If you ever find yourself standing in the cold, dark woods, and you hear whispers or see shadows moving just beyond the trees, remember our story. Some places are better left alone, and some things are best left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape. My friends and I had rented a cabin in the mountains for a few days, hoping to get away from our hectic lives and enjoy some peace and solitude. The cabin was rustic and charming, nestled in a grove of pine trees with a view of snow-capped peaks in the distance. It was perfect for our little getaway, complete with a crackling fireplace, a stack of board games, and an old-fashioned porch swing that overlooked the serene landscape. The first night was uneventful. We sat around the fireplace, catching up and laughing about old times. The cabin had a cozy, lived-in feel, and the cold, crisp air outside made the warmth inside all the more inviting. We were so engrossed in our conversations that we hardly noticed how quickly the hours passed. The second day, we decided to take a hike. There was a trail that led to a nearby overlook, promising spectacular views of the valley below. We set out after breakfast, eager to stretch our legs and explore the area. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, winding through thick forest and occasional open glades. The snow had recently fallen, making the landscape look like a winter wonderland. About halfway through the hike, we stopped at a clearing to catch our breath. As we chatted and enjoyed the view, one of my friends, Sarah, noticed something strange. There were large, fresh tracks in the snow that led off into the trees. They didn't look like any animal tracks we were familiar with. They were too big and oddly shaped, almost like a mix between a human foot and a large animal's paw. We followed the tracks for a short distance, curiosity getting the better of us. The tracks led to a small, abandoned cabin we hadn't seen on our way up. It was dilapidated, with its roof sagging and windows broken. The sight of it gave me an unsettling feeling, but I tried to brush it off as nerves. After all, it was just an old cabin, probably a relic from some past era. As we approached, the door creaked open on its own. We hesitated, but the curiosity was too strong. We decided to take a quick look inside. The interior was even more disturbing. Dust-covered furniture, old newspapers scattered across the floor, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow any sound we made. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay. We explored the small cabin, each of us feeling more uneasy as we went. Nothing seemed out of place, just the remnants of what looked like an old hunting lodge. But there was something about the place that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The silence was too complete, too absolute. After a few minutes, we decided to head back to the main trail. As we were leaving, Sarah noticed something else, an old journal lying on a table in the corner of the room. It was leather-bound and looked like it had been there for decades. Against my better judgment, I picked it up, feeling a strange compulsion to open it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the writing faded and hard to read. But as I flipped through, one entry caught my eye. It was dated from the 1970s and described strange occurrences in the area, people going missing, mysterious figures seen in the woods, and unsettling noises heard at night. The last entry was dated just a few days before the journal was left behind, describing an encounter with something that should not be seen and urging anyone who found the journal to leave the area immediately. A chill ran down my spine as I read the final entry. It was a warning, a plea for safety. We hurriedly left the cabin, feeling a growing sense of dread. The strange tracks in the snow and the old journal were enough to make us eager to return to the safety of our own cabin. That night, back at our cabin, the atmosphere was tense. We couldn't stop talking about what we'd found and the eerie feeling we'd had at the abandoned cabin. We decided to stay inside and play some board games to distract ourselves from the creeping unease. It was late when we finally turned in. I had trouble sleeping, tossing and turning as I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. Just past midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud noise. It sounded like something was scratching at the walls of the cabin. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin as if whatever it was searching for a way in. I quietly got out of bed and went to check on my friends. They were all asleep, their breathing steady. I didn't want to alarm them, so I decided to investigate the noise on my own. I crept around the cabin, checking the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, but the scratching persisted. I finally decided to go outside and see if I could find the source. Wrapped in a heavy coat and armed with a flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked around the cabin. The scratching was louder now, coming from the back of the cabin. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise and froze. There, against the wall, was a dark figure. It was hunched over, its face hidden in the shadows. The scratching came from its hands, which were clawing at the wall with a frantic, almost desperate rhythm. I could barely make out its form, but it was tall and thin, within a natural way of moving. I didn't wait to see more. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. I woke my friends, explaining what I had seen, and we quickly gathered our things. We didn't want to stay another minute in that cabin. We packed up as fast as we could, the scratching sound growing louder as if it was right outside the walls. Just before dawn, we finally left the cabin. The drive back was tense and silent, none of us willing to speak about what had happened. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The snow had covered the tracks we had seen earlier, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something behind, something that wasn't quite finished. It wasn't until we were safely home that I let myself think about what I had seen. I still don't know what that figure was or what it wanted. All I know is that the warning in that old journal was more than just an old tale. It was a truth we had stumbled into, and one that made me grateful we had left when we did. The scratches on the wall, the figure in the shadows, it was all too real. And now, every time I hear a scratching noise at night or see something out of the corner of my eye, I remember that cold winter night and the warning that we had ignored. Whatever was out there is still in those woods, and it's waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path. A few months ago, I experienced something that completely shifted my perspective on what's truly frightening. I was house sitting for a friend who lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was a beautiful place, but with its creaky floors and labyrinthine layout, it had a way of making the most mundane things feel unsettling. The day started off uneventfully. I spent my time catching up on reading and enjoying the solitude. As evening approached, I decided to make some dinner. The house was quiet, with only the sound of the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the power went out. I was in the kitchen when it happened. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I wasn't overly concerned. It was a common occurrence in this old house, and I had a flashlight handy. I rummaged through a drawer for some candles and matches, managing to get a few lit to provide some semblance of light. After settling down with a book by candlelight, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the floor above, where the bedrooms were located. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted and seemed to follow a deliberate pattern. It was almost as if someone was tapping on the floorboards with a purpose. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It was driving me crazy, so I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up the staircase. The old wood creaked under my feet, adding to the eerie ambience. I reached the top floor, where the tapping was now unmistakable. It seemed to come from the room at the end of the hall, the master bedroom. I approached the door and hesitated before pushing it open. The flashlight beam revealed an empty room with a large, antique bed and a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust sheets. I walked around, looking for any source of the noise, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping had stopped as soon as I entered the room. I checked under the bed, in the closet, and behind the curtains, but everything was as it should be. I shrugged it off and returned downstairs. Back in the living room, I tried to get comfortable again, but the sense of unease lingered. I put on some music, hoping to drown out any further disturbances. The power was still out, so I was relying on candles and the faint glow of my flashlight. Hours later, just as I was about to head to bed, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder and more erratic, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the house settling or maybe even a critter in the walls. I decided to go back upstairs and check again. As I climbed the stairs, the tapping grew even louder. It was now accompanied by a low, groaning sound, which made my skin crawl. I reached the top floor and noticed that the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight around. The room was still empty, but then I noticed something odd. The dust sheets on the furniture seemed to be disturbed, and the bed had a large indentation in the center, as if someone had recently sat down. I backed away slowly, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I took a deep breath and decided to call my friend, hoping they might provide some insight into these strange occurrences. As soon as I picked up the phone, the power was restored, and the house was flooded with light. The tapping and groaning sounds stopped instantly. My friend answered the phone and reassured me that there was nothing unusual about the house. They suggested that it might just be the old pipes or some loose floorboards. I felt a bit foolish, but their explanation did little to calm my nerves. That night, I stayed awake in the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I checked the house thoroughly, but everything seemed in order. I didn't sleep much, and the following day I was more than ready to leave. I never did find out what caused the tapping or the strange noises. My friend assured me it was just the quirks of an old house, but the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain, and the old Victorian house had more than its fair share of secrets. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when my roommates left for a concert, leaving me alone in our old apartment. I was looking forward to some solitude, catching up on reading, enjoying a late dinner, and just relaxing. Little did I know, the evening would turn into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. The apartment was on the top floor of a vintage building with creaky floors and narrow hallways. It was the kind of place with character, and while it sometimes felt a bit spooky, I usually enjoyed the charm it brought. That night, after my roommates left, I settled into the living room with a good book. The gentle hum of the heater and the distant sounds of the city outside made for a comforting backdrop. Around 9 p.m., I decided to make some popcorn and watched a movie to unwind. As I was preparing the popcorn, I heard a faint knock on the apartment door. It was so quiet and unexpected that I almost didn't believe my ears. I went to the door and looked through the peephole, but no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off as a prank or a neighbor's mistake. Returning to the kitchen, I heard the knock again, this time louder and more insistent. My heart started to race. I went to the door again, peeking through the peephole and checking the hallway. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it, feeling a bit uneasy. I went back to the living room, trying to distract myself with the movie. Just as I was about to relax, I heard the knock again, this time coming from the window. I froze, my mind racing. The window was on the far side of the room, and the only thing outside was a sheer drop to the street below. I walked over and cautiously pulled aside the curtain. Outside, the window was perfectly clear. No one was there. I checked the locks and made sure everything was secure. I returned to my movie, trying to shake off the feeling of paranoia creeping in. The knocking stopped, and I thought maybe it was just the wind or some other harmless explanation. I was about to relax when I heard a different sound, a faint scratching noise coming from the ceiling. The noise was rhythmic and persistent, like something or someone was moving around up there. My pulse quickened. I knew the building had a roof access, but it was locked, and no one else had access to it. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic, trying to convince myself it was just rodents or the building settling. The attic was dark and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. I shone the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. The scratching noise had stopped. I felt silly for being so anxious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back downstairs, trying to calm myself. As I reached the living room, I noticed that the lights in the apartment seemed dimmer, and there was an odd chill in the air. I checked all the windows and doors again, but everything was secure. Just as I was about to sit down, I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. I rushed in, but nothing was amiss, just the empty popcorn bowl on the counter. I tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself that the apartment was old and creaky, and noises could easily be explained away. Finally, I settled back into the living room, keeping all the lights on and the doors locked. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. The knocking and scratching remained unexplained. When my roommates returned, I recounted the night's events. They were skeptical but assured me it was probably just the old building making noise. We checked the attic again together, but there was nothing unusual. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The knocking and scratching remain a mystery, and while nothing bad happened to me, the feeling of being watched and the unexplained noises still haunt me. I've learned to accept that some experiences defy explanation, and sometimes, the scariest thing is not knowing what's lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding.